Can you talk a little bit about the basic premise of a campfire experience? And these were done virtually. I know you can also translate
Mhm.
this in person, but let's talk about the virtual experience, since
Mhm.
so many of our listeners are in that world right now.
Yeah, well, let's first acknowledge that I call it the campfire experience because people related to us, Jessica, have been gathering around campfires for millennia and created bonds that matter.
Mhm.
So I have no delusions that I invented this idea or that it's an innovation. Quite the opposite. It's the whatever the opposite of innovation is, that's what this is. So it's an acknowledgement. It's acknowledgement that the contexts that we need to create the relationships, let's call it friendships that we want, we need something that looks like a campfire. What I mean by that is it meets three criteria. The first is that people are physically close enough. We'll talk about virtuals in a moment, but physically close enough that they can have a possibly intimate conversation. The second one is that they have the freedom to have the conversation they want, which is to say, not driven by an agenda that's not consistent with the relationship you're trying to create. And the last one is all the conditions that would distract away from that conversation have been handled, which is to say there aren't beer commercials blasting. There are people trying to sell raffle tickets. There isn't machinery going on that runs the stage while you're trying to have intimate conversations. That's what I call a campfire experience. And of course, you recognize that describes every actual campfire for every family for the last 5 millennia coming together. When the pandemic happened and we could not gather in person, we just applied this virtually, and this idea that, first of all, we need to remove the distractions. We need to give a free space without another agenda for those conversations. And as far as being close enough, we respected what I call the Brooks lines of communication, that we had a group of 5 or smaller. And for those who are listening, if you Google Brooks lines of communication, you'll see their diagrams that show how many lines of communication are being managed in a group of people. And you'll see that when we add one more person to a group of 5, the number of communication lines that are being managed actually goes up 50%. It's an enormous bump up in management than it is in people. So when we understand that, we as leaders, bringing people together, can give ourselves permission to keep the group small. And as you already mentioned, Jessica, this was created by Google. Google's a big company, and from what I gather, nobody thinks small in anything, right? There's this assumption, just some hyperbole here, but there's an assumption that if Google's going to do it, it's got to be big, and it's got to be beautiful, it's got to be admirable. God bless them. But when you're trying to bring thought leaders together in a pandemic, that's going to work exactly against that. And to their credit, the people who were creating the project we were on, they understood this. And so we scheduled originally, if I remember correctly, 1 hour of small groups, 5 or less, and 3 and 2 count, of these selected thought leaders to spend an hour in a conversation with a prompt that was very, very general, if I remember. And I also remember there was so much hunger for it that the conversations would go to 90 minutes, because even though these were busy thought leaders talking on a camera, they just wanted the conversation to go. And I think we started as an experiment for a couple months because we didn't know how long the pandemic was going. And then, as you already mentioned, it went on for more than a year. And the feedback we got in this impossibly simple, impossibly small, impossibly seemingly innocuous program was that these thought leaders said that they consider the other participants professional family. And even I was shocked by that, because I know that when we connect in the physical world, we see profound shifts. But I didn't know how that would happen virtually. And to be fair, if we had spent that much time physically sharing figuratively pizza, we would have seen even more extreme responses, but it worked out.
Yeah, and there are organizations now that have gone 100% virtual all the time. And so I know that you've been working on translating these principles of belonging into more virtual environments. Do you have any other recommendations to share with our listeners around how they can translate some of your principles for belonging into a virtual environment specific? Maybe give an example if you can think of one off the top of your head.
I'm going to go back to what we used for the campfire experience was to remember that small is better. And I'll just give you an example of how this goes awry. I was contacted by a very large, famous tech company that you've heard of that said that they have distributed teams and they're trying to use this principle of breaking people into small groups and having these online sessions. And they told me that people didn't like it and people didn't want to stay longer, right? But they were forcing people to do it because they thought it was a good idea. And I said, well, how many people are in your small groups? And the answer was 15. And if you look at the lines of communication, that's just totally unmanageable. And I don't know anybody who wants to spend an hour call with 14 other people they don't know well and don't have an agenda. But in the minds of a company with 6 digits of employees, 15 is terribly small, but it was misguided. So as far as adapting, it's remember when you go to big events, you inevitably find a small group of people to have a conversation. And you're also looking for a place that is quiet enough that you can hear about what's going on. And we need to bring that. So I guess the second point I'll bring up is trust that if you make the invitation with authenticity, that the intention is to bring people together to knit together relationships. Trust that you don't need to fill that time with entertainment. And I've seen a lot of confusion that, well, if we invited these important people, or at least important to us, we need to keep them entertained the whole time. And what that does is it doesn't give them permission to step in with a new conversation. For example, you and I, Jessica, know everybody we know over the last, let's just say 3 years, has either been facing a serious medical challenge or taking care of someone in their family with a serious medical challenge of some kind. And if we're working with someone for 3 years, we'd probably want to know if their spouse is visiting the hospital, every 10 days, or the person we're working with is in pain constantly because they're trying to recover. But if we don't give them room to share that, which is to say, not try to fill every minute with entertainment, we're not going to learn that. So we have to be brave enough to trust that people will step into that if we schedule that time and then frame it appropriately. We're just scheduling this time to learn what's going on with each other and find out the way we can be helpful.